Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The old hunting lodge, nestled deep within the Blackwood Peaks, wasn't just remote. It felt like a scar on the face of the earth. Its weathered timber walls sagged, its windows were perpetually misted, and a perpetual chill clung to its very stones, even in the height of summer. For Liam, Chloe, Sam, and Maya, it was meant to be an escape, a desperate attempt to outrun the silent, suffocating weight that had settled over their lives. They had been inseparable since college, a quartet bound by shared dreams and late-night talks. But somewhere along the winding road of adulthood, the light had faded. Liam, the quiet artist, hadn't touched a brush in months, his studio gathering dust like a forgotten tune. Chloe, the outwardly cheerful one, maintained her bright facade with a terrifying fragility, her eyes betraying a deep, unyielding weariness. Sam, the cynical joker, found his wit turning bitter, his laughter hollow. And Maya, the meticulous academic, was drowning in a sea of research papers she could no longer comprehend, her sharp mind dulled by an endless fog. Their collective depression, a silent, insidious fifth member of their group, had become an unspoken pact of misery. The idea for the retreat had been Chloe's, a last-ditch effort to reconnect with nature and ourselves. Liam had nodded vaguely, Sam had snorted a sarcastic remark about therapy in the wilderness, and Maya had merely stared at her laptop screen, unseeing. Yet they had come. Anything was better than the suffocating familiarity of their own apartments, each a monument to their individual despair. The lodge, however, offered no solace. The moment they stepped inside, the chill intensified, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. Their first night was filled with forced cheer. Chloe unpacked board games. Sam poured cheap whiskey. Liam stared into the crackling, reluctant fire, and Maya tried to read, her eyes scanning lines without registering meaning. But the lodge seemed to listen. Every creak of the old timbers, every groan of settling foundations, felt amplified, deliberate. The silence between their strained conversations was heavy, expectant. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls of Liam's room, directly behind his bed. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. He tried to rationalize it, a loose floorboard in the room above, a branch against the exterior. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence of his room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts. Chloe, meanwhile, found herself plagued by phantom laughter. Not the joyful sound she so desperately tried to project, but a thin, reedy giggle that seemed to emanate from the empty corners of the kitchen, especially when she was alone, trying to force herself to cook. It was undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy, a sound of ancient, malicious amusement. She'd spin around, clutching a saucepan, only to find nothing but the oppressive silence and the pervasive cold. It made her forced smiles crack, revealing the raw despair beneath. Sam, ever the cynic, started hearing his own voice, distorted and mocking, whispering his deepest insecurities back to him from the shadows of the common room. Worthless. Failure. Everyone sees it. He'd snap back, "Shut up," only to be met with silence, and the chilling realization that no one else had heard it. His sarcasm became a frantic defense, aimed at invisible tormentors. Maya, in her attempt to find solace in logic, began to notice her meticulously organized research notes scattering themselves across the floor, or pages turning on their own in her open books. One night, she watched, horrified, as a pen rolled across the table and began to draw a series of intricate, swirling symbols on a blank page, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with the scent of ozone, like after a lightning strike. They tried to talk about it, huddled around the sputtering fireplace, their faces pale in the flickering light. "Are you guys hearing things?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe nodded, her eyes wide and tearful. "The laughter, it's everywhere." Sam just stared into his whiskey glass. "My own damn voice, telling me I'm a joke." Maya, however, tried to rationalize. "It's the isolation, the stress, the old house settling. Our minds are playing tricks on us." But even as she spoke, her gaze darted nervously towards the shadows, her voice lacking its usual conviction. Their shared depression, instead of binding them against the encroaching horror, seemed to be amplifying it, making them more vulnerable, more isolated within their own minds. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of Liam's bedroom wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the lodge's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses Chloe kept smelling, now sickly sweet and putrid. Chloe, unable to bear the laughter any longer, found herself drawn to the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. She could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards above, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding her, pressing in. She scrambled back, tripping over her own feet, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Sam, driven to the brink by the mocking whispers, started shouting at the empty air, his face contorted with rage and fear. He threw a whiskey bottle at the wall, shattering it, the crash echoing through the silent house. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The whispers only grew louder, more numerous, a chorus of derision. Maya, desperate to find a logical explanation, stumbled into the lodge's small, dusty library. The books on the shelves seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. She pulled out an old, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. As she opened it, the symbols she'd seen drawn by the pen on her notes were scrawled across the first page, accompanied by archaic script. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. She began to read, her eyes widening in horror as she deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lodge, echoing from the attic. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through their already frayed nerves. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before. Then, from the attic access panel, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the hallway floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the attic opening, something began to descend. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the hallway. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the provider Maya had just read about, the entity that fed on their despair. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from them. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hallway, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on the four friends with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with their ears but impressed directly into their minds, echoed in their skulls, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Liam stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. Chloe let out a whimpering sob, her forced cheer utterly shattered. Sam stared, his cynicism replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Maya dropped the journal, its brittle pages scattering, her academic mind reeling from the impossible, horrifying truth. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled them with a horror that transcended even their deepest depression. This wasn't just a fix. It was a pact. They were its sustenance. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards them. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in their guts screamed for it, but their minds recoiled. Run! Liam screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. They turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. They scrambled through the living room, past the shrouded furniture, their feet slipping on the dusty floorboards. The lodge seemed to come alive around them, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow them whole. They reached the front door, their hands fumbling with the ancient lock, their fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the floorboards growing louder, a relentless pursuit. They could feel its presence behind them, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, Sam wrenched the door open, snapping the old lock, and they burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit them like a shock, washing over their sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the lodge. They didn't look back. They just ran, blindly, through the overgrown yard, past the skeletal trees, towards the faint, distant lights of Blackwood Peaks. They could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind them, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed on the side of the winding mountain road, gasping for air, tears streaming down their faces. The despair still clung to them, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. They had seen the face of their own darkness, and it had been hungry. They eventually found their way back to civilization, a small, lost group, their eyes haunted, their bodies emaciated. They tried to explain, to warn, but their words came out as choked sobs, incoherent babbling. No one believed them. They were just four depressed friends who had gone on a disastrous retreat. They never returned to the Blackwood Peaks. They abandoned all their belongings, their cars, their past lives within those walls. The cheap lodge had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. Months later, scattered across different cities, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The shared trauma, the sheer, undeniable horror they had faced together, had forged a new, fragile connection between them. They talked now, truly talked, about the lodge, about their despair, about the unspeakable thing that had fed on their sorrow. The shared secret was a bond, a dark anchor that paradoxically pulled them closer, a testament to their survival. Their depression wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into their very beings. But they faced it together now, no longer isolated islands of sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, Liam would still feel a lingering chill. Chloe would hear a faint, reedy chuckle. Sam would swear he heard his own mocking voice, and Maya would see faint, swirling symbols in the patterns of condensation on a window. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that the old hunting lodge wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And they were just 4 more offerings in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night they escaped its insidious embrace. They were survivors, but they were also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed them whole. They had escaped, yes, but they carried a piece of the lodge, and its despair, within them, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed them. The rain lashed against the windows of the old Victorian house, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of Arthur's heart. He sat in his motorized wheelchair, a prisoner in his own living room, the power outage rendering his usual escape routes, the television, the internet, even the electric kettle, useless. He traced the smooth, cold metal of his joystick with a thumb, a futile gesture. Without power, the chair was a fancy, oversized paperweight. Arthur, a man in his late 40s, had been a paraplegic since a car accident in his 20s. He'd built a life for himself, adapted his home, and cultivated a fierce independence. But nights like this, when the world outside turned into a howling void and his carefully constructed sense of control crumbled, a primal fear gnawed at him. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder split the air, rattling the very foundations of the house. The emergency battery light on his wheelchair flickered, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Arthur let out a choked gasp. He was blind. Not literally, of course, but without the dim glow of the power indicator, the familiar contours of his living room vanished, replaced by an oppressive, inky blackness. He fumbled for his phone, a small, cold comfort in his shaking hand. No signal, of course. The storm had likely knocked out the cell towers. He was truly alone. The house, usually a haven, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the old timbers, every drip of water through a leaky gutter, was amplified, distorted into something sinister. He remembered the stories, the local legends whispered by the neighborhood kids. Old Mr. Abernathy, who'd lived in this house before him, had supposedly gone mad in his final years, convinced the house was alive, that it watched him. Arthur had always scoffed at such tales, but now, in the suffocating darkness, a chill snaked up his spine that had nothing to do with the failing furnace. He strained his ears, listening over the roar of the rain. Was that a whisper? He held his breath, the only sound the frantic thumping of his own pulse in his ears. Nothing, just the storm. He tried to rationalize, to remind himself that he was a sensible man, that fear was an irrational response to a simple power cut. But the rational part of his brain was shrinking, overshadowed by something far more primitive. Then he heard it again, a distinct scratching sound, coming from the wall behind the antique grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't the skittering of mice. This was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like fingernails dragging across plaster. Arthur's breath hitched. He knew that wall, It was solid, no access panels, no pipes that could cause such a noise. He swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. "Hello?" He croaked, his voice thin and reedy in the vast darkness. The scratching stopped. A long, agonizing silence followed, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Arthur's hands, clammy with sweat, tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. He wanted to move, to roll away from the sound, but he was pinned. His chair was useless. Then a new sound, a low, guttural groan, emanating from somewhere above him. The second floor, his bedroom, perhaps. His mind raced, desperately trying to conjure a logical explanation. The old house settling, a tree branch scraping against the roof, but the sound was too human, too filled with a profound, desolate sorrow. He remembered a fleeting thought he'd had when he first bought the house. The previous owner, Mr. Abernathy, had died in his sleep in the very bed that was now Arthur's. Had his spirit lingered? Arthur scoffed again, a nervous, humorless sound. He didn't believe in ghosts, but what if he was wrong? A faint, sickly sweet odor began to permeate the air, overriding the usual mustiness of the old house. It was a cloying, unsettling smell, like overripe flowers and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Arthur's stomach lurched. He heard the thump-thump-thump then, slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the main staircase. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the oppressive darkness, to see something. But there was nothing, only the absolute blackness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The footsteps paused on the bottom step, just outside the living room. Arthur could almost feel a presence there, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He could hear ragged, shallow breathing closer now, accompanied by a faint, wet gurgle. "Who's there?" Arthur demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound brave. No answer. Only the breathing, the gurgling, and the relentless drumming of the rain. Then a new sound, the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of liquid hitting the wooden floor. Arthur's imagination, already running wild, conjured grotesque images. Blood, or something worse. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He heard a soft sigh, a sound of immense weariness. Then the footsteps began again, slowly, deliberately entering the living room. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, as if by doing so, he could make whatever was there disappear. But the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder, closer. He could almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. A cold, clammy touch brushed against his cheek. Arthur yelped, a strangled sound of pure terror. He recoiled, trying to push himself back, but his useless legs refused to respond. He was utterly helpless. The touch lingered, a feather-light caress that felt strangely curious. Then it moved, tracing the line of his jaw, his chin, his neck. He could feel something else now, a faint, foul breath on his face, sickly sweet and reeking of decay. He opened his eyes, staring into the impenetrable blackness. He could feel the presence leaning over him, closer now, so close he could almost hear a faint, hissing sound. A single, elongated finger, cold and dry as old bone, touched his lips. Felt brittle, fragile, yet strangely strong. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't scream, couldn't even whimper. The finger moved, sliding over his mouth, then resting lightly on his Adam's apple. He could feel the faint tremor in the finger, a strange, almost human tremor. Then, a voice, a mere whisper, yet it resonated with an ancient, profound sadness. It was like wind chimes made of cracked glass, barely audible over the storm. Lonely, so lonely, Arthur's mind reeled. The voice was so close, so intimately close. He felt something else now, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth against his forehead, as if the unseen presence was leaning in, examining him. "You stay," the voice whispered again, a faint breath against his ear. "Forever." A new sound then, a rasping, tearing noise, like cloth being ripped, coming from the direction of his armrest. Arthur flinched, pulling his arm back as much as he could. He felt a sharp, stinging pain on his forearm, a cold, wet sensation. He gasped, his breath ragged. He wanted to cry out, to yell for help, but no sound would escape his throat. The scratching returned, more intense now, coming from all directions. The walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards beneath him seemed to be alive with a multitude of unseen claws. The air grew colder, heavy with the sickly sweet odor. He felt the presence move away from him. Then he heard the slow, dragging footsteps again, moving back towards the staircase. The drip, drip, drip resumed, fainter now, receding with the footsteps. Arthur lay there, paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He could hear the footsteps ascend the stairs, slow and deliberate, until they faded into the general cacophony of the storm. The scratching continued, a symphony of unseen claws, now accompanied by a faint, mournful humming sound, coming from the upper floor. It was a tuneless, sorrowful sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. He didn't know how long he lay there, trembling in the dark. Time seemed to lose all meaning. His mind, still reeling from the encounter, tried to make sense of it, to find a rational explanation. But there was none. He touched his forearm, where he'd felt the stinging pain. His fingers came away wet and sticky. He brought them to his nose. The sickly sweet, metallic scent was undeniable. Blood, his blood. A new wave of nausea washed over him. He was truly alone, at the mercy of whatever was in the house with him. He heard a faint creak from the hallway. He tensed, his body rigid with fear. Was it coming back? No, the sound was different this time, less deliberate. He heard another creak, then a faint thud, like something had fallen. He strained his ears. Silence, just the rain. Then, miraculously, a faint flicker of light. The emergency light on his wheelchair. Pulsed weakly at first, then held steady. The power was back on. A wave of relief, so potent it made him dizzy, washed over him. He could move. He could escape. He fumbled with the joystick, his hands still shaking. The chair hummed to life, a blessed mechanical whir. He turned, the faint light from the wheelchair's display casting long, dancing shadows across the room. His gaze fell upon the grandfather clock. Behind it, on the wall where he'd heard the scratching, a dark, viscous stain marred the floral wallpaper. It was a crude, distorted symbol, drawn in something dark and glistening, and beside it, scrawled into the plaster, as if with a sharp, pointed object, a single word, meaning. Arthur swallowed, his stomach churning. He quickly spun his chair around, heading for the front door. He just needed to get out. As he reached the entrance to the living room, his eyes fell upon the bottom step of the staircase. There, lying on the worn wooden floor, was a small, ornate silver locket. It was open, and inside, a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with a strangely familiar, melancholic gaze. He didn't remember seeing it before. He was sure he hadn't. And then, he noticed something else. A faint, almost invisible trail of damp, reddish-brown drops leading from the locket, across the floor, and disappearing up the stairs. The drip, drip, drip he had heard earlier. He looked at his arm again. The cut was still there, but it wasn't deep, just a scratch. He hadn't felt anything sharp. He looked back at the locket, then up the dark, silent staircase. The humming, the scratching, the whispers, a sudden, horrifying realization dawned on him. The touch on his face, the finger on his lips, the breath. It hadn't been malicious. It had been curious. And the voice, it had been lonely. The scratching on the wall, the groan from upstairs, the drip, drip, drip of liquid. It wasn't a monstrous entity. It was something lost, something trapped. And the cut on his arm. What if it wasn't a wound inflicted by a monster, but a desperate plea for connection? He looked at the words scrawled on the wall, mine. Not as in possession, but as in kinship. He rolled his wheelchair to the front door, his hand hovering over the lock. The rain was still falling, but the thunder had subsided. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim, reassuring glow through the windows. He could leave. He could call for help. But as he looked back at the locket on the floor, at the dark stain on the wall, at the silent, imposing staircase leading to the unknown, a different kind of fear, a colder, more profound one, settled over him. What if he left and it followed him? What if it needed him? What if he was the only one who could truly understand its loneliness? He slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand away from the lock. He spun his wheelchair around, facing the staircase. He had spent his life adapting, finding ways to live with his limitations. Now, perhaps he had to adapt to something else entirely. Something unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. The house was still dark upstairs, but the faint glow of his wheelchair's light seemed to reach up, beckoning. He took a deep breath, the lingering scent of decay and sweet flowers still in the air. He pushed the joystick forward. The motorized wheelchair hummed, and slowly, resolutely, Arthur began to ascend the stairs, towards the unseen presence that had whispered its desperate loneliness in the dark. He was no longer a prisoner of his home, but perhaps a reluctant companion in a chilling, shared solitude. The whispering walls of Blackwood Manor. The old Ford Bronco coughed its last breath at the edge of the overgrown driveway, a final metallic wheeze that seemed to echo the weariness in Liam's own bones. Dust, thick and red from miles of unpaved road, coated every surface, blurring the lines between the truck, the dying light of the setting sun, and the skeletal trees that clawed at the bruised sky. Before him, shrouded in a perpetual twilight even in the fading afternoon, stood Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just old. It was ancient, a hulking silhouette against the horizon, its gables like jagged teeth, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. Local legend whispered of its former inhabitants, the Blackwood family, who had vanished without a trace over a century ago, leaving behind a legacy of chilling tales and an estate that no one dared to claim. Liam, a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay and the macabre, saw not a haunted house, but a canvas, a challenge, a story waiting to be told through his lens. He grabbed his heavy camera bag, the familiar weight a small comfort against the prickle of unease that had begun to crawl up his spine the moment he turned off the main road. The air grew colder as he approached, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old blood. The iron gates, rusted to a brittle lace, groaned a protest as he pushed them open, the sound a mournful sigh in the stillness. The driveway, once meticulously paved, was now a fractured mosaic of cracked flagstones and tenacious weeds. A lone, gnarled oak, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes, stood sentinel near the crumbling porch, its leaves rustling with an almost human whisper. Liam paused, his hand instinctively going to the small, silver crucifix he always wore beneath his shirt. He wasn't particularly religious, but some places just demanded a little extra protection. The front door, a massive slab of dark, splintered wood, hung ajar, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness. He pushed it open further, the hinges screaming in agony, a sound that reverberated through the silent house. The air inside was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of dust, mildew, and something else, something that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. A faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten potpourri mixed with the metallic tang he'd noticed outside. He switched on his powerful headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a grand foyer swallowed by shadows. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from the chandelier, which hung precariously, its crystal pendants dulled by a century of neglect. The grand staircase, once a testament to opulence, now sagged precariously, its banister splintered, its steps groaning under the weight of time. "Hello?" Liam's voice, a mere whisper in the vast emptiness, was swallowed instantly, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. He felt foolish, but the silence was oppressive, demanding some kind of vocal intrusion. He began his work, camera clicking, the flash momentarily illuminating forgotten details. A tarnished silver tray on a dust-laden side table, a faded portrait whose eyes seemed to follow him, a moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene, the figures frozen in an eternal chase. Each click of the shutter felt like a heartbeat, a small defiance against the overwhelming stillness. As he moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere grew heavier. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, not just with his weight, but with an unsettling rhythm, as if something else was moving, just out of sight. He entered what must have been the drawing room, its once vibrant wallpaper peeling in grotesque strips, revealing the dark, damp plaster beneath. A grand piano, its keys yellowed and silent, stood in one corner, a sheet of music still open on its stand, the notes faded beyond recognition. He raised his camera, framing a shot of the piano, when a faint, discordant note seemed to drift from its keys. Liam froze, his finger hovering over the shutter button. He waited, straining his ears, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the oppressive silence, punctuated by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, a trick of the old house and his own frayed nerves. He continued his exploration, his headlamp sweeping through the gloom, revealing a dining room with a massive empty table, its chairs overturned as if a sudden, violent departure had occurred. Then the kitchen, a cavern of rusted appliances and shattered crockery. Each room told a story of abandonment, of lives abruptly interrupted. It was in the master bedroom that the true chill set in. The four-poster bed, its canopy torn and shredded, dominated the room. On the bedside table, a porcelain doll sat propped up, its painted eyes staring blankly into the darkness. Its dress, once pristine, was now grimy and torn. Liam felt a cold dread seep into his bones. Dolls, especially old ones, always unnerved him. This one, however, felt different, felt watched. As he aimed his camera at the doll, a faint scratching sound emanated from inside the wardrobe. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. Liam's breath hitched. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just imagining things anymore. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely a croak. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more profound, more menacing. He took a hesitant step towards the wardrobe, his hand trembling as he reached for the ornate, tarnished handle. He pulled it open with a sudden jerk, revealing not a person, but a cavernous, empty space. The scratching had stopped, but the faint, sweet, metallic smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. He shone his light into the depths of the wardrobe, seeing nothing but dust motes dancing in the beam. He slowly closed the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He backed away from the wardrobe, his eyes fixed on the doll. Had it moved, or was it just his mind playing tricks? He couldn't be sure. He decided it was time to move on, to explore the upper floors, to get away from the unsettling presence of that doll. The staircase groaned under his weight as he ascended, each step a testament to the house's decay. The upper landing was a maze of shadowy doorways. He chose the first one, pushing open a door that led into what appeared to be a child's nursery. The air here was even colder, carrying a faint, sweet scent, like baby powder mixed with something else, something sickly. A rocking horse stood in the center of the room, its painted eyes chipped, its mane tangled. A crib, its wooden bars splintered, stood against one wall. And on the floor, scattered amongst the dust and debris, were a collection of antique toys. A tin soldier, a wooden train, a small porcelain tea set. Liam's headlamp swept across the room, and then he saw it. On the far wall, faintly visible beneath layers of grime and peeling wallpaper, was a series of childlike drawings. Stick figures, houses, suns, and then, in one corner, a crudely drawn figure with long, spindly limbs and empty, staring eyes. It was unsettling, the kind of drawing that would give you nightmares. He felt a sudden, intense drop in temperature, a cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. He shivered violently, his breath misting in the frigid air. Then, From the corner of the room, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible giggle. A child's giggle. Liam spun around, his headlamp darting frantically, but there was nothing. Just the rocking horse perfectly still and the empty crib. His blood ran cold. He was definitely not alone. He stumbled back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get out. He had to leave this place. He turned to flee, but as he did, his foot caught on something. He looked down and saw a small wooden block painted with a single, faded letter, L. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his ankle as he twisted it, sending him sprawling to the floor. His headlamp clattered away, plunging the room into near darkness. Only a sliver of moonlight, filtering through a grimy window, offered any illumination, casting long, distorted shadows. He scrambled to retrieve his headlamp, his fingers fumbling in the gloom. As he reached for it, a small, cold hand brushed against his. He recoiled, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He shone the light, his hand shaking, but there was nothing there, only the wooden block still lying on the floor. He snatched up the headlamp, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ankle. He had to get out, now. He limped out of the nursery, his eyes darting wildly, convinced he saw movement in the periphery of his vision, heard faint whispers carried on the cold air. He stumbled down the grand staircase, each creak of the wood a fresh jolt of terror. He reached the foyer, the front door still ajar, a beacon of hope. He lunged for it, his hand outstretched, when a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed it shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the house. Liam cried out, stumbling back. He tried the handle, but it was stuck, jammed tight. Panic, cold and raw, seized him. He was trapped. He turned, his headlamp sweeping the foyer, and then he saw them. Shadows. Not just ordinary shadows, but shapes that seemed to writhe and coalesce in the corners of the room, growing larger, darker, more defined. They were indistinct at first, like smoke, but then they began to take on forms, tall and slender, with elongated limbs and heads that seemed to tilt at unnatural angles. A low, guttural growl seemed to emanate from the very walls, a sound that vibrated through his chest. The air grew impossibly colder, and the sweet, metallic scent intensified, making him gag. He backed away, pressing himself against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows advanced, slowly, deliberately, their forms becoming clearer. He could almost make out features now, empty eye sockets, mouths stretched in silent screams. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But the cold was too intense, the growling too real, the scent too pervasive. He opened his eyes, and they were closer now, almost upon him. He screamed, a raw, primal sound ripped from his throat, and lunged for the nearest window, smashing his camera against the glass. It shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying inwards. He didn't care about the cuts, the pain. He just needed to escape. He scrambled through the broken window, tearing his clothes, his skin, but he didn't feel it. He landed hard on the overgrown lawn, his injured ankle screaming in protest. He pushed himself up, ignoring the pain, and began to run. He ran blindly, stumbling through the darkness. The sounds of the house, the growling, the whispers, the faint, childish giggles echoing in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the rusted gates, tearing his hands on the sharp iron as he forced them open. He didn't stop until he reached his Bronco, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, a miraculous sound. He slammed the gear into reverse, spinning the truck around, and sped away, leaving Blackwood Manor behind, a dark, malevolent presence against the moonlit sky. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and that house. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced the darkness, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, he pulled over on the side of a deserted road, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked down at his hands, still shaking, and then at his camera bag, which lay on the passenger seat. He hesitated, then reached for it, pulling out his camera. He scrolled through the images he had taken, his heart sinking with each click. The foyer, the drawing room, the dining room, the kitchen, all were there, captured in stark, chilling detail. But then he got to the master bedroom, the image of the porcelain doll, and next to it, barely visible in the shadows, was a faint, translucent figure, a child. Its eyes were dark, empty, staring directly into the lens. He gasped, dropping the camera. He scrolled further to the nursery, the rocking horse, the crib. And then, in the corner where he had seen the crude drawing, was the same translucent figure, standing beside the rocking horse, its head tilted, a faint, chilling smile on its lips. He threw the camera onto the seat, his stomach churning. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. They were real. He looked up, his eyes scanning the horizon, the rising sun, the familiar world. But the world no longer felt familiar, felt tainted. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never truly escape Blackwood Manor. Its whispers, its shadows, its cold, dead eyes would haunt him forever. And the faint, sweet, metallic scent, he knew now what it was. It was the scent of death, the scent of a presence that had never left. And it was clinging to him, a silent, invisible shroud. He was marked, and Blackwood Manor would always be waiting. The Blackwater Point Lighthouse stood like a skeletal finger against the bruised, perpetually overcast sky, its beam a lonely, sweeping arc against the churning gray ocean. It wasn't just remote. It felt like the very edge of the world, a forgotten sentinel guarding nothing but endless, turbulent water. For Lena Petrova, a woman whose life had been a relentless series of losses and quiet disappointments, it was meant to be a refuge. She had fled the suffocating familiarity of crowded city streets and the sympathetic glances of friends who didn't know what to say. Her grief, a raw, gaping wound after the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of her younger brother, had become a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. The isolation of Blackwater Point, with its ceaseless murmur of the waves and the biting wind, was meant to be a balm, a place where she could finally exhale, or perhaps simply fade away. From the moment she stepped onto the rocky path leading to the lighthouse, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of sea salt was present, certainly, but it was laced with something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a grave. The air was cool, almost too cool, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into her bones, no matter how many layers she wore. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. The ceaseless roar of the ocean was a muffled, distant thrum, like a giant's heartbeat beneath the earth, never truly loud, always just a low, unsettling vibration. Her first few days were a blur of learning the lighthouse's ancient mechanisms, polishing the massive Fresnel lens, and making endless log entries in the dusty keeper's journal. The lighthouse was vast and empty, its winding spiral staircase and echoing chambers amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of her own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very stone, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor of the lantern room, making it hard to truly rest even during her brief off-duty hours. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick glass of the lantern room itself, directly behind the massive lens. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant glass, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each night around midnight, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Lena's skull, even when she buried her head under her pillow in the small, cramped keeper's quarters below. She'd pound on the ceiling, yelling, "Is anyone there?" Her voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Lena would press her ear against the cold, damp stone, straining to hear, but the moment she focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving her in the oppressive, damp silence, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the coastal air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very stone, from the very ocean. It clung to her, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of her vision, darting just beyond the reach of her sight, like dark figures slipping between the gnarled rocks below, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling mist outside the lantern room. When she turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the sea. Her isolation, once a comfort, began to turn into a torment. The radio, her only link to the mainland, seemed to crackle with increasing static, its signals growing weaker, more unreliable. She tried to dismiss it as a faulty antenna, but a growing unease gnawed at her. One particularly misty evening, the fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the distant coastline and blurring the line between sky and sea. Lena was in the lantern room, polishing the lens, the tapping a faint, persistent hum in the background. She noticed something new. The light from the powerful bulb, usually a crisp white beam, was now unnaturally dim, its glow diffused by the mist, yet it seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly green hue. And then, from the depths of that green-tinged light, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around her, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around her like a shroud. Her blood ran cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the ocean. This was something else. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the polished metal floor, her eyes wide and unblinking in the encroaching gloom. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her quarters, the faint glow of her phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old wood a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Lena tried to contact the mainland. The radio was dead, only a persistent, low hum. She looked through the lighthouse's ancient logbooks, hoping to find some record, some clue. The entries were sparse, mostly weather reports and supply deliveries. But then, deeper in the book, she found it. Scrawled in a shaky hand, dated over a century ago, were a series of frantic entries. The tapping begins, the cold, the whispers. The light changes hue. It feeds on the loneliness, the sorrow. It waits for the broken. And then, a series of crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the page, identical to ones she'd seen in her own nightmares, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with ozone, like after a lightning strike, and the sweet, metallic scent intensified. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lighthouse, echoing from the very depths of the ocean. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through her already frayed nerves, freezing her in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the massive Fresnel lens itself, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the polished metal floor of the lantern room. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the depths of the lens, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim, sickly green light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the light should have been. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the metal floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the logbook had described, the creature that fed on despair, the one for which the lighthouse was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from her. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire lantern room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim, green light, and it fixed on Lena with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with her ears but impressed directly into her mind, echoed in her skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your loneliness, my meal. Lena stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping her lips. Her grief, already so profound, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled her with a horror that transcended even her deepest despair. This wasn't just a job, it was a pact. She was its sustenance. The lighthouse was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards her. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in her gut screamed for it, but her mind recoiled. No! Lena screamed, her voice raw, finally breaking free of her paralysis. She turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. She scrambled down the spiral staircase, past the silent, watchful walls, her feet slipping on the worn steps. The lighthouse seemed to groan around her, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The stone walls buckled, the metal groaned, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow her whole. She burst out the heavy, iron-bound door at the base of the lighthouse, into the cool, damp air of the night. The distant lights of the mainland, usually a comforting glow, seemed impossibly far away. She didn't look back. She just ran, blindly, through the rocky terrain, towards the faint, distant glow of the horizon. She could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind her, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out, until she collapsed on the side of the winding, unpaved road, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. The despair still clung to her, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. She had seen the face of her own darkness, and it had been hungry. She never returned to Blackwater Point Lighthouse. She abandoned all her belongings, her logbooks, her very identity within those stone walls. The remote sanctuary had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. She left the coast that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror she had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away her cynicism, leaving her with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. She no longer sought solace. She sought only escape. Her grief wasn't cured, not in the way she had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into her very being. But she faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, she would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear she heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Blackwater Point Lighthouse wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten maritime tragedies. And she was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night she escaped its insidious embrace. She was a survivor, but she was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed her whole. She had escaped, yes, but she carried a piece of the lighthouse, and its despair, within her, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed her. The old Blackwood Research Facility, a sprawling concrete monolith half swallowed by the perpetually foggy forest, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a forgotten secret buried deep within the earth. Its utilitarian facade was streaked with grime, its few windows opaque with lichen, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very foundations, even under the rare shafts of sunlight. For Dr. Alistair Finch, a disgraced xenobotanist whose career had imploded after a controversial and proven theory, it was meant to be a final, desperate act of vindication. He sought proof, a definitive answer to the unusual seismic and bioluminescent anomalies reported deep within this remote sector. He believed the facility, once a hub for classified ecological studies, held the key, a forgotten truth buried beneath decades of institutional silence. But from the moment his battered SUV crunched onto the overgrown access road, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of damp earth and decaying leaves was present, certainly, coating everything in a fine layer of forest detritus. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his expedition gear. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale concrete, decaying insulation, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a forgotten grave. His first few hours were a blur of navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned facility, his high-powered flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive darkness. Lab equipment lay overturned, rusted conduits hung from crumbling ceilings, and the echoing silence was punctuated only by the drip of unseen water and the scuttle of unseen vermin. The facility was vast and empty, its subterranean levels amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly focus on his self-appointed mission. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old biocontainment wing, directly behind a rusted, bolted door. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each time he paused, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded through a broken skylight far above, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Alistair's skull, even when he tried to focus on his geological readings. He'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Alistair would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, But the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the forest air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal remains of lab benches, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust motes illuminated by his flashlight. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the facility. His scientific detachment, once his greatest strength, began to fray. The rational explanations he clung to felt increasingly thin. He found himself talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about the readings and the anomalies. He developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. He complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to attribute it to the dust, the isolation, the sheer grind of his self-imposed investigation. But a growing unease gnawed at him, the feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless searching, seemed to deepen with each passing hour. One particularly damp afternoon, a sudden, unseasonal squall whipped through the broken vents, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Alistair's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Alistair huddled in a former control room, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his geological scanner, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a reinforced server room, the faint glow of his laptop a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Alistair sought out the facility's abandoned archives, a room he'd previously avoided, fearing the sheer volume of forgotten research. He found it behind a heavy, warped steel door, its lock long rusted away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decaying paper. He found a series of project logs, their pages brittle with age. He began to read, his fingers trembling. The entries were chilling, detailing escalating anomalies, not from seismic activity, but from a bioluminescent growth discovered deep underground. Researchers describing the whispers, the tapping, the cold that eats at you. One entry, dated over 50 years ago, spoke of a presence that feeds on despair, on the minds of those who seek answers. And then, deeper in the journals, he found it, scrawled in a shaky hand, identical to the symbols his last patient had drawn in her final, terrifying moments. Crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the margins. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering, the long stay, the contagion. And then, a familiar name, scrawled faintly in the margin. Finch, not his first name, but his surname. A chilling coincidence, or something far more sinister? A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the facility, echoing from the very depths of the earth. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, bolted door of the biocontainment wing, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the containment units once stood. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the journals had described, the creature that fed on despair, on the broken minds, on the very essence of human suffering. The one for which the facility was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire containment room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Alistair with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your guilt, my meal. Your search for truth, my invitation. Your mind, my new home. Alistair stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His scientific detachment, his last bastion of sanity, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a research trip. It was a pact. He was its sustenance. The facility was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Alistair screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the facility, past the forgotten labs and rusted equipment, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The facility seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The concrete walls buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He burst out the main entrance, the heavy steel doors looming. His hands fumbled with the ancient lock, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the concrete growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the doors open, snapping the old chains, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the facility. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the dense, fog-shrouded forest, towards the faint, distant glow of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood Research Facility. He abandoned his SUV, his equipment, his very identity within those walls. The search for truth had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left the forest that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought solace. He sought only escape. His sanity wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Research Facility wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten scientific logs. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the facility, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. One morning, he woke up to the familiar tapping, not from a dream, but from the wall beside his bed. It was soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer, more insistent. Tap, 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 and then a faint, almost inaudible whimper. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, and from within the wall he heard it, a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. He closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over him. He was back. The entity had found him, and this time he knew it wasn't just feeding on his despair. It was spreading. He felt a faint, iridescent shimmer begin to pulse from his own skin, a cold, sweet warmth spreading through his veins. He was the new host, the new conduit. And the tapping, he realized with a final, horrifying clarity, was coming from inside him. The apartment, Unit 4B of the Blackwood Lofts, wasn't just old. It felt ancient, burdened by a century of lives lived and secrets buried within its crumbling brick facade. I, Clara Vance, a newly minted freelance writer escaping the suffocating familiarity of my hometown, had taken the cheapest available unit on the 4th floor, a spacious but perpetually dim studio overlooking a perpetually rain-slicked alley. The rent was impossibly low, a red flag I'd optimistically ignored. But in the relentless churn of urban life, a bargain was a bargain, even if it came with the faint, persistent smell of dust and something vaguely metallic. My first week was uneventful, filled with the usual unpacking and the distant, muffled hum of the city. My only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible chill that permeated my apartment, even with the rattling radiator blasting. It wasn't just cold. It was a damp, clinging cold that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how many layers I wore. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made me pull my threadbare blanket tighter around me, a physical manifestation of the profound loneliness that had followed me from my old life. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as typical old building noises. Pipes groaning, wind howling through loose panes, the distant wail of sirens echoing off brick. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, repetitive tapping seemed to emanate from the walls of my bedroom, directly behind my headboard. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. I tried to rationalize it. Old wiring, settling foundations. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. I'd press my ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving me in the oppressive, damp silence of my small room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold spot became more pronounced. It wasn't just the overall chill of the apartment. There was a specific area, the corner near the old, unused fireplace, that was always unnaturally frigid. Stepping into it was like walking into a meat locker, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old blood, and something else, too, a faint whiff of stagnant water. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within my soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. I huddled under my thickest duvet, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on me. Then, distinctly, over the drumming rain and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around me, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around me like a shroud. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a pipe. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. I scrambled out of bed, pulling my blanket with me, my eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the furthest corner of my living room, the faint glow of my phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old wood a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted Mrs. Petrov, the ancient, perpetually scowling building manager who lived on the first floor. Her apartment reeked of mothballs and stale cigarettes. Mrs. Petrov, I began, trying to sound calm. I've been hearing strange noises in my apartment, like scratching and voices. Her eyes, roomy and dark, fixed on mine. A long, drawn-out puff of smoke curled from her lips. Noises? She rasped, her voice like grinding gravel. Is old building, always noises? She paused, her gaze unwavering. You hear voices? There was a strange emphasis on the word, a subtle shift in her tone that made my skin crawl. Just a whisper, maybe a giggle? I stammered, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth, yet unable to stop myself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed her weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. She took another slow drag from her cigarette. Don't pay attention to it, she finally said, her voice dismissive, but her eyes held a strange, knowing glint. Is just the building settling, is very old building. The conversation was clearly over. Her denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. Confirmed my fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The building comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything I had experienced. The scratching became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of my bedroom wall. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the building's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing I had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses, now sickly sweet and putrid. I couldn't stay in my apartment. Not another minute. Every shadow felt alive, every creak a stealthy step towards me. Grabbing my keys and phone, I fled into the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights doing little to dispel the gloom. The hallway itself felt different. The air was heavier, colder, the scent of decay stronger here, clinging to the peeling wallpaper and the frayed edges of the once grand runner. The light from my phone seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. As I walked, my bare footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, I noticed something new. On the wall opposite my apartment door, etched faintly into the peeling paint, were a series of symbols. They were crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and flow, almost identical to the ones I'd seen in an old, forgotten book from my library days, the ones that had haunted my dreams. My blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over me. This wasn't just my apartment. This was connected, part of something larger, darker, and infinitely more sinister. I hurried down the 4 flights of stairs to the ground floor, my heart pounding a frantic drum against my ribs. The chanting grew louder with each descending step, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that pressed against my eardrums. The stairwell was a vortex of cold, dank air, each breath feeling heavy and thick. As I reached the ground floor, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The main lobby, usually lit by a single weak bulb, was now bathed in an eerie, pulsing red light. It flickered erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls, making the antique furniture seem to writhe and contort like tortured figures. And then I saw the source. The ancient, heavy wooden door to the building's basement was ajar, a sliver of the pulsing red light escaping from within. From that gaping darkness, the smell of decay was overpowering, thick and cloying, making me gag. And the chanting, now a deafening crescendo, was clearly coming from below. It wasn't just chanting anymore. It was a frantic, desperate chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet its tone was unmistakably one of supplication and terror, a chorus of pleading and agony. My legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Every rational fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run out the main door, to never look back, to flee Blackwood Lofts and never utter its name again. But the sight of those symbols, the chilling implication that this wasn't just my building, but part of a larger, darker tapestry, held me captive. The writer in me, the part that sought truth, however dangerous, compelled me forward. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly, hesitantly, I pushed the cellar door open further. The red light pulsed more intensely, bathing the descending steps in a hellish glow. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing liquid, a suffocating mixture of decay, ozone, and something else. Something distinctly metallic, like rust and old, congealed blood. The chanting was deafening, a relentless assault on my sanity, twisting my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. It clawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to pull me under, to drown me in its ancient sorrow. I began to descend the creaking, wooden stairs, each step a descent into an ever-deepening abyss of horror. The walls of the stairwell were slick with condensation, gleaming with an unnatural sheen in the pulsing red light. As I went deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill so profound it felt like needles piercing my skin, the air so cold it burned my lungs. The scratching I had heard in my apartment seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 1,000-fold, as if countless unseen entities were tearing at the very fabric of the building, trying to break free. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The pulsing red light spilled from a vast, open chamber at its end. I edged forward, my hands scraping against the rough, damp brick wall, the cold, gritty texture doing little to ground me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost spongy, squishing faintly with each step, a sickening sound in the oppressive silence. And then I saw them, faint, dark streaks on the floor, gleaming in the sporadic light, leading towards the red glow. They looked like drag marks, long, distinct trails, as if something heavy, something wet had been pulled through this darkness. The chanting in the chamber swelled, rising and falling in terrifying waves, a cacophony of agony and devotion. It was no longer just voices. There were other sounds mixed in. A wet, tearing noise like flesh being ripped. A soft, squelching sound like something being crushed underfoot. And then a low, guttural growl, deep and ancient, that vibrated through the very ground. A sound of immense, unfathomable hunger. I reached the entrance to the chamber and stopped, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide with disbelief and unspeakable terror. The room was immense, its true size obscured by the pulsing red light and shifting shadows that danced like tormented spirits. In the very center, on a raised, crudely constructed stone slab, was what looked like a massive, dark mass. It pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm as the red light, its surface glistening wetly, reflecting the infernal glow. From it, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked outwards, disappearing into the impenetrable shadows, like roots seeking nourishment or veins seeking blood. And kneeling around the slab, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles that defied human anatomy, their faces obscured by the pulsing light and self-inflicted wounds that oozed dark liquid, were a dozen or so figures. They were chanting, their voices raw and desperate, their hands raised towards the pulsating mass, their movements jerky and spasmodic, like puppets on invisible strings. They were dressed in tattered, archaic clothing, the fabrics rotted and clinging, their skin pale and almost translucent, stretched taut over visible bone. As the red light pulsed, I saw fleeting glimpses of something utterly horrifying. Their eyes were not human. They were black, vacant pools, reflecting only the infernal glow, devoid of all life and sanity. And their mouths were stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, some stained dark, some dripping. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a sickening miasma that coated my tongue and burned my lungs, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh, coppery blood and something else, something fetid and unholy, a stench of pure, concentrated evil that seemed to cling to my very soul. Strewn across the floor around the slab were discarded bones, dark, viscous stains, and scattered, personal effects. A tarnished locket, a child's worn shoe, a broken pair of spectacles, each item a silent testament to a life brutally ended, a life offered. A chilling realization struck me. The whimpering, the giggling, the tapping, it had all been from them. The building wasn't just old. It was a charnel house, a factory of despair. The escape, one of the figures, thinner and more gaunt than the others, its hair a stringy, dark mess, suddenly rose. Its head snapped towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its neck had been broken and roughly reattached. It let out a piercing, unearthly shriek that ripped through the oppressive air, a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that would forever haunt my nightmares. The other figures stopped their chanting, their heads slowly, synchronously turning towards me, their movements chillingly unified, their black, empty eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze that promised unspeakable torment, an ancient, boundless hunger. The pulsating mass on the slab seemed to throb faster, its tendrils quivering, elongating, reaching. My mind fractured. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. A hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the crushing weight of my own loneliness. But the overwhelming sensory assault proved it was terribly, viscerally real. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, back towards the stairs, the piercing shrieks of the figures echoing behind me, joined by the sickening sound of their bare feet pounding on the stone floor, gaining on me, a relentless, inhuman pursuit. I scrambled up the steps, 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the cold, damp air tearing at my throat, each breath a desperate fight for survival. The chanting resumed below me, now frantic, furious, a chorus of rage and dark purpose, mixed with the terrifying growl of the entity on the slab, a sound of immense, predatory satisfaction. The red light pulsed through the cracks in the door, painting the stairwell in shifting hues of hell, each flicker a glimpse into an abyss. I could feel their presence behind me, the cold, stale breath of death on my neck, their formless, hungry touch brushing against my skin, raising goosebumps of pure horror. I burst out into the dimly lit lobby, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, my body racked with a terror I had never known. The main front door of the Blackwood Lofts, the heavy, imposing oak door that usually required a key, was now standing slightly ajar, a sliver of glorious, mundane street light peeking through. It was an invitation, a promise of escape, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with a desperate surge of strength, scraping my hands raw against the splintered wood, and stumbled out onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. The cool night air hit me like a revelation, a cleansing wave washing over my sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of decay. The distant sounds of the city, the honking cabs, the chatter of late-night revelers, were a symphony of normalcy, a lifeline back to sanity. I didn't look back. I just ran, never stopping, never pausing, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, until the crumbling brick facade of the Blackwood Lofts was a distant, horrifying memory, swallowed by the darkness behind me. The lingering scars. I never returned to the Blackwood Lofts. I abandoned all my belongings, my few pieces of furniture, my books, my entire life within those walls. The impossibly low rent had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. I left the city that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror I had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away my cynicism, leaving me with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. I no longer sought solace. I sought only escape. My loneliness wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into my very being. But I faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, I would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear I heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Lofts wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And I was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night I escaped its insidious embrace. I was a survivor, but I was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed me whole. I had escaped, yes, but I carried a piece of the building, and its despair, within me, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed me. The old Blackwood Asylum, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and shattered windows, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a collective scream, trapped within its decaying walls. Its towering turrets pierced the bruised twilight sky, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very foundations, even under the harsh glare of the midday sun. For Dr. Eris Thorne, a disgraced psychiatrist haunted by a malpractice suit that had cost him his license and his reputation, it was meant to be a final, desperate act of defiance. He sought proof, a definitive answer to the whispers that had plagued his last patient, a young woman driven to madness by unseen tormentors. He believed the asylum held the key, a forgotten truth buried beneath decades of institutional neglect. But from the moment his rented car crunched onto the gravel drive, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of dust and decay was present, certainly coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his tweed jacket. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale disinfectant, decaying plaster, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a forgotten grave. His first few hours were a blur of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive darkness. Patient records lay scattered, rusted restraints hung from crumbling walls, and the echoing silence was punctuated only by the occasional scuttle of unseen vermin. The asylum was vast and empty, its high ceilings and endless, dark tunnels amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly focus on his self-appointed mission. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old hydrotherapy wing, directly behind a rusted, bolted door. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each time he paused, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded through a broken skylight, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Eris's skull, even when he tried to focus on his notes. He'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Eris would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the autumn air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal remains of patient beds, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the asylum. His scientific detachment, once his greatest strength, began to fray. The rational explanations he clung to felt increasingly thin. He found himself talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about the patients. He developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. He complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to attribute it to the dust, the isolation, the sheer grind of his self-imposed investigation. But a growing unease gnawed at him, the feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless searching, seemed to deepen with each passing hour. One particularly dust-choked afternoon, A strong wind whipped through the broken windows, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Eris's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Eris huddled in a former nurse's station, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his medical bag, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a padded cell, the faint glow of his phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eris sought out the asylum's abandoned archives, a room he'd previously avoided, fearing the sheer volume of forgotten suffering. He found it behind a heavy, warped wooden door, its lock long rusted away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decaying paper. He found a series of patient journals, their pages brittle with age. He began to read, his fingers trembling. The entries were chilling, detailing escalating madness, not from mental illness, but from external torment. Patients describing the whispers, the tapping, the cold that eats at you. One entry, dated over a century ago, spoke of a presence that feeds on despair, on the broken minds. And then, deeper in the journals, he found it, scrawled in a shaky hand, identical to the symbols his last patient had drawn in her final, terrifying moments. Crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the margins. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering, the long stay. And then, a familiar name, scrawled faintly in the margin. Thorn, not his first name, but his surname. A chilling coincidence, or something far more sinister? A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the asylum, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, bolted door of the hydrotherapy wing, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the hydrotherapy tubs once stood. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the journals had described, the creature that fed on despair, on the broken minds, on the very essence of human suffering. The one for which the asylum was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hydrotherapy room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Eris with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your guilt, my meal. Your search for truth, my invitation. Eris stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His scientific detachment, his last bastion of sanity, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a research trip, it was a pact. He was its sustenance. The asylum was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Eris screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the asylum, past the forgotten cells and rusted equipment, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The asylum seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the main entrance, the heavy iron gates looming. His hands fumbled with the ancient lock, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the concrete growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the gates open, snapping the old chains, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the asylum. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown grounds towards the faint, distant lights of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood Asylum. He abandoned his car, his medical bag, his very identity within those walls. The search for truth had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left Blackwood that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His sanity wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Asylum wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten patient files. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the asylum, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. One morning, he woke up to the familiar tapping, not from a dream, but from the wall beside his bed. It was soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. And then, a faint, almost inaudible whimper. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, and from within the wall he heard it, a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniable human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. He closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over him. He was back. The asylum had found him, and this time he knew there would be no escape. The tapping continued, a maddening rhythm, inviting him back into the darkness. He was IT. The Serenity, a sleek, modern research vessel, cut through the sapphire waters of the Pacific. Dr. Eris Thorne, a marine biologist whose life was dedicated to the ocean's mysteries, stood on the deck, the salty spray a familiar kiss on his face. He inhaled deeply, the scent of salt and ozone a comforting balm. Below, his team prepared for their deep-sea expedition, a venture into the Mariana Trench, a place of crushing pressure and eternal darkness, where life was thought to be sparse, if not impossible. The sheer scale of the undertaking was daunting, a plunge into the last true frontier on Earth. Eris, however, harbored a different theory. He believed in the persistence of life, even in the most hostile environments. His current obsession was a series of anomalous sonic readings, faint but persistent, emanating from a previously uncharted section of the trench. They were too regular, too complex to be geological. They hinted at something alive, something that defied conventional understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. These readings, picked up by an experimental array of hydrophones deployed months prior, had become his waking thought and his restless dream. His team consisted of Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant but cautious oceanographer, whose sharp intellect was often tempered by a healthy dose of skepticism. Ben Carter, the pragmatic and ever-joking submersible pilot, whose easygoing demeanor belied a razor-sharp focus under pressure. And Maya Singh, the quiet, meticulous data analyst, whose fingers danced across keyboards with an almost preternatural speed. The atmosphere on board was a mix of professional excitement and underlying apprehension, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of their conversations. The trench was unforgiving, a realm where even the slightest miscalculation could mean oblivion. Their submersible, the Triton, was a marvel of engineering, a sphere of reinforced titanium and composite alloys, designed to withstand pressures that would crush a battleship into a crumpled tin can. Its external lights alone consumed enough power to illuminate a small town. As they began their descent, the sunlight faded with startling rapidity, replaced by the Triton's powerful floodlights, which pierced the growing gloom with twin beams of artificial daylight. The ocean outside transformed, from vibrant blue to a deep, ominous indigo, then to an inky black, punctuated only by the sporadic, ethereal bioluminescent flashes of strange, deep-sea creatures, ghostly jellyfish, anglerfish with their lures like malevolent stars, and unseen forms that flitted just beyond the reach of their lights. The pressure gauges climbed steadily, each increment a stark reminder of the crushing forces building around them. The sonic readings intensified as they neared their target depth. They were rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but far too slow, too deep to be anything known. It was less a sound and more a vibration, a resonant thrum that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their chests. Lena adjusted the hydrophones, her brow furrowed in concentration, her usual caution replaced by a growing fascination. Eris, these aren't just sounds. They're patterns, like communication, and their incredibly low frequency, almost infrasound. Something truly massive would be needed to generate this. Ben, ever the practical one, scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. Communication? Down here? From what? Giant squid playing charades. Or maybe the trench itself is just having a bad day. But even his joke held a tremor of unease. Eris, however, felt a thrill of anticipation that bordered on reverence. Perhaps something far older, Ben. Something that has adapted beyond our wildest imaginings. Something that has thrived in this darkness for millennia, evolving in ways we can barely conceive. He leaned closer to the sonar screen, his eyes gleaming. They reached the floor of the trench, a vast, desolate plain of volcanic rock, jagged fissures, and hydrothermal vents that spewed superheated, mineral-rich water into the frigid abyss. The Triton's lights revealed a landscape alien and stark, a silent, primordial world that had remained unchanged for millions of years. And then, Maya's voice, a hushed whisper that cut through the hum of the submersible systems, broke the profound silence. Movement, large, very large, directly ahead. And it's not a single echo. It's a complex, undulating mass. The sonar screen flared with a massive, elongated shape, far larger than any known marine creature. It was moving slowly, deliberately, towards them, its scale almost incomprehensible. The sheer size of the blip on the screen made their breath catch in their throats. Ben, full stop, Eris commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Lena, get a visual.
Max magnification.
Lena's fingers flew across the console, manipulating the external cameras. The image on the main screen flickered, then resolved into something that made their blood run cold, a sight that would forever haunt their nightmares. It was a shark, but not just any shark. This creature was immense, easily twice the size of a great white, perhaps even 3 times, its body a ghostly, pale gray, almost translucent in the submersible's lights. Its skin was ancient, scarred by untold battles with unseen horrors of the deep, covered in what looked like phosphorescent barnacles that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, like a constellation of malevolent stars. Its eyes, however, were the most terrifying feature. They were not the dead, black, unseeing eyes of a typical shark, but large, intelligent orbs, glowing with an internal predatory light that seemed to pierce the Triton's hull and look directly into their souls. And its teeth, they were not merely rows of jagged points, but massive obsidian blades, some broken, others unnaturally long, like ancient daggers, each one capable of shearing through steel. My God, Lena breathed, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. It's a megalodon? No, it's too big. And those eyes, they're aware. The creature circled them, its movements slow, deliberate, almost curious. It wasn't attacking, not yet. It was observing, assessing, like a colossal hunter studying its prey. The rhythmic thrumming, the heartbeat, seemed to emanate directly from it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the Triton's hull, a sound that seemed to bypass their ears and resonate within their very bones. It's not just a shark, Eris whispered, a chilling realization dawning on him, a cold dread seeping into his veins. It's evolved, adapted to this environment. It's using echolocation, but something more, something that allows it to perceive us, perhaps even our thoughts. It's reading us. Suddenly, the Triton shuddered. The shark had gently nudged them, a colossal, silent inquiry. The pressure outside was immense, and even a gentle touch from such a creature felt like a hammer blow, a warning. The submersible creaked in protest. It's trying to communicate, Maya said, her voice barely audible, her fingers trembling as they hovered over her keyboard. The patterns, they're becoming more complex. It's not just sound. It's a language, a very old language. Eris, driven by a desperate scientific curiosity that momentarily eclipsed his fear, activated the external microphone, attempting to broadcast a series of simple tones, a basic greeting. The shark responded instantly, its hum intensifying, the patterns shifting, becoming more intricate, more demanding. It was a terrifying, exhilarating moment of first contact, a bridge across an unimaginable evolutionary chasm. But then the hum changed. It became agitated, sharper, filled with a deep, resonant growl that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their bones, a sound of profound displeasure. The shark's glowing eyes narrowed, its massive body tensing, its movements no longer curious but menacing. "It's angry," Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What did you do, Eris? What did you say?" "I don't know," he stammered, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I just tried to respond, tried to acknowledge it." The Triton lurched violently as the shark slammed into them, not with a gentle nudge, but with the full, unbridled force of its immense body. Alarms blared, a cacophony of red lights and piercing sirens. Lights flickered, then died in sections of the submersible. "Hull integrity compromised," Ben yelled, wrestling with the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "We're losing power to the main thrusters. Auxiliary power failing." The shark attacked again, its obsidian teeth scraping against the Triton's reinforced hull, producing a horrific screech that echoed inside the submersible, a sound of metal tearing and grinding. The creature wasn't just attacking. It seemed to be trying to pry them open, like a colossal predator cracking a nut, its intelligence focused on breaching their defenses. "It wants in," Maya whispered, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the monstrous eye outside the viewport. "It wants us. It's not just curious. It's hunting." Eris's mind flashed back to the old workshop, to Elias Thorne's journal, and the hunger of the puppets for flesh and blood. This creature, this ancient leviathan, had the same hunger, but on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. It wasn't just a beast. It was an intelligence, an ancient, malevolent will that had survived in the crushing darkness, evolving to become the ultimate predator, a living embodiment of the abyss.
Ben, evasive maneuvers.
Anything, full reverse, divert all remaining power to the thrusters. Eris shouted, but the Triton was sluggish, hampered by the damage, its systems failing one by one. The shark hit them again, this time tearing away a section of the external plating near the stern. Water began to seep in, a thin, chilling stream that quickly became a steady trickle. The pressure outside was immense, and even a small breach was catastrophic. The submersible groaned, its metal shell groaning under the strain. "We have to ascend," Lena screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria, her hands pressed against the cold metal of the console. "Now, before it's too late." Ben fought the controls, his knuckles white, the Triton protesting with every movement. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to rise, the damaged thrusters struggling against the immense water resistance. But the shark was relentless. It followed, a pale, glowing phantom in the darkness, its hum a constant, terrifying presence, growing louder with every meter they ascended. It was faster than they expected, its massive tail propelling it with surprising speed, an impossible agility for a creature of its size. It struck again, this time at the Triton's primary propulsion system, the massive propellers at the rear. A sickening crunch, a sound of twisting metal and shattering components. The submersible lurched violently, then began to spin, tumbling uncontrollably through the black water. Lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the faint, eerie glow of the shark's eyes outside, which seemed to penetrate the very hull. "Emergency power," Eris yelled, fumbling for the backup controls, his fingers brushing against cold, unresponsive switches. A single, weak light flickered on, illuminating their terrified faces, casting long, dancing shadows. The hum was now deafening, a resonant vibration that filled the submersible, making their teeth ache, their very bones vibrate. The shark was right outside, its massive eye pressed against the viewport, staring in, an intelligent, ancient gaze that promised only oblivion. And then the hum changed again. It was no longer angry, but a low, resonant purr, a sound of deep satisfaction, of anticipation. And within it, Eris heard something else, something that wasn't sound, but a thought, a primal, ancient hunger that resonated directly in his mind, bypassing his ears, invading his consciousness. We have waited. We are hungry. We are the deep. And you are merely a taste of the surface. The Triton groaned, its metal hull protesting, the sound of tearing metal growing louder. A hairline crack appeared in the main viewport, spiderwebbing outwards with terrifying speed, a delicate, deadly pattern of impending doom. It's going to break through, Lena shrieked, pressing herself against the console, her eyes squeezed shut. We're going to be crushed. Ben, surprisingly calm in the face of absolute terror, grabbed a flare gun, his hand steady. If we're going down, he said, his voice grim, we're taking a piece of it with us. He aimed the flare gun at the glowing eye, a futile gesture against such a monstrous adversary. Eris knew it was futile. This creature was beyond flares, beyond human weapons, beyond any defense they could mount. It was a force of nature, an apex predator that had mastered the abyss, a being that had existed in the crushing darkness for eons, waiting for its moment. The crack widened, a jagged line across the viewport. Water began to spray in, a fine, cold mist that quickly turned into a torrent. The pressure was building, the submersible groaning like a dying beast, its internal structure beginning to buckle. The shark's hum intensified, filling their minds, drowning out their screams, their last, desperate breaths. It was a symphony of hunger, a song of the deep, a lullaby of annihilation. Eris felt his consciousness blurring, his thoughts becoming one with the resonant hum. He saw images in his mind. Vast, ancient oceans, countless eons of silent predation, the endless, crushing darkness. He saw other shapes, other glowing eyes, lurking in the abyss, waiting. Not just one, many, an entire lineage of these leviathans, slumbering in the unfathomable depths, awakened by their intrusion. The viewport shattered. The last thing Eris saw was the massive, glowing eye of the shark, inches from his face, and the gaping maw filled with obsidian blades, rushing towards him. The crushing pressure, the icy water, the primal hunger, it all consumed him in an instant, a final, terrifying embrace from the deep. The Serenity waited on the surface, its crew scanning the empty expanse of the Pacific. Days turned into weeks. The Triton was never found. The anomalous sonic readings from the Mariana Trench ceased, as if the very abyss had swallowed them whole. The ocean returned to its deceptive calm, its surface shimmering innocently under the sun. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the ocean was a vast, black mirror, sailors reported hearing it. A faint, deep hum, resonating from the depths. A sound that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten eons and an insatiable hunger. And sometimes, just sometimes, they saw it. A fleeting pale glow beneath the waves. A pair of intelligent predatory eyes, watching, waiting, for the next vessel to venture into the deep. The ocean, after all, held secrets far older and far more terrifying than humanity could ever comprehend. And some of those secrets, once awakened, never truly sleep. They only wait for the next meal, the next unsuspecting soul to fall into the deep's embrace. Zephyr Vance was a titan on the field. His name, a whisper of wind, belied the hurricane of power he unleashed with every tackle, every sprint, every impossible catch. At 6'4" and 250 pounds of sculpted muscle, he was a defensive end who struck fear into the hearts of quarterbacks across the league. His career was a meteoric rise. Heisman Trophy winner, first-round draft pick, and now a three-time Pro Bowler with a Super Bowl ring glinting on his massive hand. But beneath the gleaming helmet and the roar of the crowd, Zephyr carried a secret, a growing darkness that threatened to consume him. It began subtly during the off-season. He'd always been intense, driven, but this was different. He started experiencing vivid, unsettling dreams. Not nightmares, not exactly, but hyper-realistic visions of plays, of tackles, of the stadium lights, but with a disturbing, almost predatory edge. In these dreams, his opponents weren't just players. They were something else, something fragile, He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of bone crunching beneath his grip. Then came the whispers. At first, he dismissed them as the lingering echoes of concussions, the price of glory. Faint, indistinct voices always just at the edge of hearing, urging him on, pushing him harder. Faster, Zephyr. Stronger. Break them. He'd hear them in the quiet of his sprawling mansion, in the sterile silence of the training room, even amidst the din of practice. His teammates noticed a change. Zephyr, always focused, became unervingly so. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, sometimes seemed to glint with an unnatural intensity. His hits in practice grew more brutal, crossing the line from aggressive to genuinely dangerous. Receivers flinched when he approached. Offensive linemen found themselves inexplicably winded, even after light contact. Coach Miller, a grizzled veteran who had seen it all, pulled him aside. "Zephyr, you're a beast, son. Best in the league, but you're on edge. Everything all right?" Zephyr forced a smile. "Just focused, coach. Playoff bound, right?" Coach Miller narrowed his eyes. "Focused is one thing, reckless is another. You almost took out Henderson's knee yesterday. We need you healthy, not sidelined for unnecessary roughness." Zephyr shrugged it off, but the coach's words gnawed at him. He hadn't meant to hit Henderson so hard. It was like his body moved on its own, propelled by an unseen force, a primal urge to dominate, to destroy. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just urges anymore. They were commands, and they were accompanied by visions, flashes of grotesque faces superimposed over his opponents, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies twisting unnaturally. He saw himself not as Zephyr Vance, but as a hulking shadow, a monstrous predator. He started isolating himself. His longtime girlfriend, Chloe, a vibrant artist who had always been his anchor, noticed the distance. He'd snap at her over trivial things, his patience worn thin by the constant internal battle. He stopped sleeping, haunted by the whispers and visions. When he did sleep, the dreams were worse, more violent, more real. In one dream, he was on the field, the roar of the crowd deafening. He sacked the opposing quarterback, but instead of the usual satisfying thud, he felt a sickening crunch. The quarterback's body contorted, his limbs twisting at impossible angles, his face frozen in a silent scream. Zephyr woke up gasping, his hands shaking, the phantom sensation of warm blood on his fingers. He tried to find answers. He consulted team doctors, psychologists, even a spiritual healer Chloe had recommended. The doctors found nothing physically wrong, attributing his symptoms to stress and the pressures of elite sports. The psychologists suggested anger management and meditation. The spiritual healer, a quiet woman with knowing eyes, simply touched his hand and said, "There is something ancient clinging to you, child, something that feeds." She gave him a small, intricately carved wooden charm, urging him to keep it close. He scoffed, but kept it in his locker. The season began. Zephyr was unstoppable. He broke records, shattered offensive lines, and became a living legend. But each victory felt hollow, tainted by the whispers, by the increasingly vivid visions, by the chilling sense that he was no longer fully in control. His hits were devastating, leaving opponents sprawled on the turf, sometimes unconscious, sometimes writhing in pain. The commentators praised his ferocity, his unmatched power. The fans roared his name, but Zephyr saw the fear in his opponent's eyes, and he knew it wasn't just the fear of a tackle. It was the fear of something else, something monstrous reflected in his own gaze. During a particularly brutal game against their arch-rivals, the whispers reached a fever pitch. The opposing quarterback, a cocky rookie, had been trash-talking all week. As Zephyr lined up, the whispers screamed in his head. "Break him! Crush him! Make him scream!" He exploded off the line. The quarterback dropped back, eyes wide as Zephyr bore down on him. Zephyr felt a surge of unnatural strength, a burning rage that wasn't his own. He tackled the quarterback, not with a precise, calculated move, but with a wild, unrestrained fury. He heard the sickening snap, felt the body go limp. The whistle blew. The crowd went silent. Zephyr looked down. The quarterback lay motionless, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling on the pristine green turf. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the sky. A wave of nausea washed over Zephyr. He stumbled back, the whispers suddenly silent, replaced by the horrified gasps of the crowd, the frantic shouts of the medical staff. He saw the fear in his teammates' eyes, the accusation in the coach's stunned gaze. He had broken him, not just his leg, but something more. The quarterback's career was over. Zephyr was suspended indefinitely. The league launched an investigation. The media frenzy was relentless. He was branded a monster, a danger to the sport. But the public outrage was nothing compared to the horror that consumed Zephyr. He knew with chilling certainty that he had lost control. He retreated to his mansion, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the image of the broken quarterback. Chloe tried to reach him, but he pushed her away, afraid of what he might do, what he might become. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, mocking. "You are ours, Zephyr. You are the vessel, the devourer." He remembered the spiritual healer's charm. He found it in his locker, a small, dark piece of wood. As he held it, a faint warmth spread through his palm. The whispers recoiled, momentarily silenced. He called the healer. She listened patiently, then told him, "The land where you play, the stadium, it was built on a place of ancient sacrifice, a place where primal energies were once invoked. And you, Zephyr, with your immense power and ambition, you drew something to you, something that hungers for strength, for dominance, for the breaking of wills." She explained that the entity, a parasitic spirit, had latched onto him, feeding on his drive, amplifying his aggression, slowly twisting him into a weapon for its own malevolent purposes. It wanted to consume him, to use his body as a conduit to inflict chaos and destruction. The whispers were its voice, its commands. The visions were its influence. "You must sever the connection, Zephyr," she warned, "before it consumes you entirely." "How?" he asked, his voice raw with desperation. "You must confront it, not on the field, but within yourself. And you must reject its power, no matter how tempting it feels." He hung up, the charm clutched in his hand. He knew what he had to do. That night, Zephyr locked himself in his study. He placed the charm on his desk. He closed his eyes, focusing on the darkness within him, on the whispers that now screamed for his attention. He felt the entity, a cold, predatory presence, coiled deep within his mind, its tendrils wrapped around his consciousness. It began to show him visions, visions of unimaginable power. He saw himself back on the field, not just dominating, but crushing, destroying, leaving a trail of broken bodies in his wake. The crowd roared, not with cheers, but with terrified screams. He saw himself as a god, invincible, unstoppable. The entity offered him ultimate control, ultimate victory. "Join us, Zephyr." The whispers hissed, now a chorus of voices, ancient and seductive. "Embrace the power. You can be more than human. You can be eternal." The temptation was immense. He had always craved control, dominance. This was the ultimate expression of it. But then, he thought of Chloe, of her gentle touch, her unwavering love. He thought of the broken quarterback, his lifeless eyes. He remembered the fear in his teammates' faces. This wasn't power, it was corruption. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. The entity raged. The room plunged into icy cold. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of primal screams. Shadowy figures writhed around him, their forms grotesque and menacing. He felt a searing pain, as if his mind was being torn apart. "You cannot resist," the entity shrieked, its voice now a monstrous roar. "We are part of you now. We are you." Zephyr clenched his fists, gripping the charm. He focused on Chloe's face, on the warmth of her hand. on the quiet strength she represented. He remembered the feeling of genuine joy, of pure, uncorrupted victory. "You are not me," he screamed, his voice raw, defiant. "You are a parasite, and I cast you out." He felt a violent, wrenching sensation, a tearing within his very being. The room exploded with blinding light, then plunged into darkness. He felt himself falling, endlessly falling, into a void. When he woke, he was lying on the floor of his study, the morning sun streaming through the window. The room was quiet. The air was clean. The metallic, sweet smell was gone. The whispers were silent. He sat up, his body aching, his head throbbing. He looked at his hands. They were his hands, strong, but no longer trembling with an unseen power. He felt empty but also clean, liberated. The wooden charm lay on the floor, splintered and charred, as if it had been struck by lightning. He had won, but the victory came at a cost. His career was over. The investigation concluded with a lifetime ban from the league, citing unprecedented behavioral issues and a pattern of dangerous play. The public scorn was immense. His endorsements vanished. His wealth, though still vast, felt meaningless. Chloe, however, returned. She found him broken but whole. She listened to his story, her eyes filled with sorrow, but also with unwavering belief. She helped him pick up the pieces. Zephyr Vance, the football titan, was gone. In his place was a man who understood the true meaning of power and the terrifying cost of its corruption. He moved away from the city, away from the stadiums, to a quiet, secluded life with Chloe. He started working with at-risk youth, teaching them discipline, strength, and the importance of controlling their own inner demons. He never played football again. The roar of the crowd was replaced by the quiet laughter of children, the thud of tackles by the gentle rhythm of life. He still had moments, flashes of the darkness, a faint echo of the whispers, especially when he saw a football game on TV. But he had learned to recognize them, to resist them. He carried the scars, both physical and emotional, of his battle. He knew that the entity, or others like it, still lingered in the world, drawn to ambition, to power, to the places where human will was pushed to its limits. He was a survivor, a cautionary tale, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispered through the trees outside his new, modest home, he would swear he could hear it, just at the edge of hearing, a faint, mournful chant, waiting for another strong soul to claim as its vessel, waiting for another game to play. But Zephyr Vance, the man, was no longer listening. He was finally free. The wrought iron gates of Blackwood House groaned open, a rusty sigh that seemed to welcome them into its shadowed embrace. Rain, cold and persistent, lashed against the ancient stone, mirroring the chill that had settled deep within Alara's bones. Beside her, her twin sister, Lyra, shivered, pulling her threadbare coat tighter. Their shared inheritance, this sprawling, decaying mansion, was less a gift and more a curse, a monument to a family history they barely knew, steeped in whispers and dark secrets. They were identical in appearance, the same startling emerald eyes, the same cascade of raven black hair, the same delicate features. Yet their personalities were starkly different. Alara was the pragmatist, grounded and cautious, while Lyra possessed a fragile sensitivity, a tendency to drift into the unseen, to hear the whispers of the wind as voices. It was this sensitivity that had brought them here, to the house their estranged great-aunt had bequeathed them, a house Lyra had seen in her nightmares for years, long before they ever knew of its existence. "It's even worse than I imagined," Lyra murmured, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the skeletal branches of an ancient oak that clawed at the mansion's highest windows. "It feels hungry." Alara squeezed her sister's hand, a gesture of reassurance she didn't entirely feel herself. "It's just old, Lyra, and neglected. We'll clean it up, sell it, and put this behind us." But as they stepped onto the crumbling flagstones of the porch, a pervasive, cloying scent enveloped them, dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood and forgotten roses. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them, stealing their breath. The front door, a massive slab of dark, carved wood, stood ajar, revealing a cavernous entrance hall swallowed by gloom. Cobwebs, thick and glistening, draped like ancient tapestries from the high ceilings. The silence within was not empty, but pregnant with unseen eyes and held breaths. "Hello," Alara called out, her voice swallowed by the vastness. Only the drip of water from a leak in the roof answered her. They entered, their footsteps echoing hollowly on the cold marble floor. The grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with grotesque gargoyles, spiraled upwards into impenetrable darkness. Portraits, their subjects' faces obscured by grime and shadow, stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow their every move. "I don't like this, Alara," Lyra whispered, her hand clutching her sister's arm. "It feels like we're not alone." Alara tried to dismiss it. "It's just the atmosphere, Lyra. Old houses always feel like this." But even as she spoke, a cold draft, impossibly cold, brushed past them, carrying with it a faint, mournful sigh. They began to explore, moving from room to room, each one a testament to forgotten grandeur and lingering despair. The drawing room, with its tattered velvet furniture, felt heavy with unspoken conversations. The dining room, its long table covered in a thick layer of dust, seemed to hold the echoes of long-dead feasts. In the library, shelves filled with leather-bound tomes stood silent witnesses to countless hours of study. Lyra paused, her fingers trailing over the spine of a particularly old book. Someone spent a lot of time here, someone very sad. As she spoke, a book on a high shelf slid out, falling to the floor with a muffled thud. Both sisters jumped. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. Alara picked it up, her brow furrowed. Just the house settling. But Lyra shook her head, her eyes wide.
No.
It wanted us to find it. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, dated almost a century ago. Her elegant script spoke of loneliness, of a stifling marriage, and of a profound, secret grief. There were frequent mentions of the children, but no names, only a growing despair. As they read, the metallic sweet scent grew stronger, and the air in the library became heavy, almost suffocating. A faint, childlike giggle seemed to echo from the floor above, followed by a soft, rhythmic thumping. "Did you hear that?" Lyra whispered, her face pale. Alara, despite her mounting unease, tried to remain rational. Probably just the wind or rats. But the thumping grew louder, more insistent, like a ball bouncing on a wooden floor. It was coming from upstairs. They ascended the grand staircase, each creak of the old wood amplified in the oppressive silence. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch them, their eyes now distinctly menacing. The air grew colder with each step. On the second floor, the thumping led them to a long, dimly lit corridor lined with more closed doors. The scent of old roses was now distinct, mingled with the metallic tang. The thumping stopped abruptly outside a door at the very end of the hall. Lyra hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. "This is it. This is where the sadness lives." The door creaked open, revealing a child's nursery. It was a tableau of forgotten innocence and lingering sorrow. A rocking horse stood in the center, its painted eyes vacant. A wooden cradle, draped in dusty lace, sat against one wall, and on the floor, a faded rag doll lay abandoned. As they stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. The metallic sweet scent was overwhelming. A low, mournful hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, a profound, aching sorrow. And then they saw them, two figures, indistinct and shimmering, materialized in the center of the room. One was a woman, tall and slender, her form radiating an unbearable sadness. The other was a small child, a boy, his form radiating a raw, inconsolable grief. They were transparent, ethereal, yet undeniably present. Lyra gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and empathy. Eleanor and her son, the ghostly child, sensing their presence, let out a silent scream, a wave of pure, concentrated anguish that washed over them, making them real. The rag doll on the floor began to tremble, then slowly, impossibly, rose into the air, hovering for a moment before dropping with a soft thud. "They're trapped," Lyra whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "They're reliving it." The woman ghost, Eleanor, turned her head slowly, her vacant eyes seeming to fix on Lyra. A faint, almost inaudible whisper slithered through the air. "My babies! They took my babies!" Ilara, despite her fear, felt a surge of protectiveness for her sister. "What happened here, Eleanor? Who took your children?" The child ghost let out another silent scream, its small form convulsing. Eleanor's sorrowful hum intensified, a protective, yet deeply despairing wall of energy. Suddenly, the nursery door slammed shut, plunging them into near darkness, save for the faint, shimmering glow of the two apparitions. They were trapped. "They don't want us to leave," Lyra whimpered, clutching Ilara's hand. The child ghost began to move, slowly, deliberately, towards them. Its small, ethereal hand reached out, its touch sending a wave of icy cold through the air. "Stay back," Ilara commanded, her voice trembling, but the ghost didn't heed her. Its hand passed through Lyra, a wave of intense cold and despair washing over her, leaving her gasping for breath, her skin clammy. "He's trying to show me," Lyra choked out, her eyes glazed over. "He's showing me the fire." As she spoke, the room around them seemed to shift, the dusty nursery dissolving into a scene of chaos and flames. They were no longer in the nursery, but in a different part of the house, surrounded by crackling fire and choking smoke. The air was hot, acrid. They saw Eleanor, younger, vibrant, but her face etched with terror, desperately trying to pull two small figures from a burning cradle. The child ghost, Thomas, was there, a terrified infant in his mother's arms. But there was another, a tiny girl, still in the cradle, enveloped in flames. "My sister," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with a profound, shared grief. He couldn't save her. The scene flickered, then dissolved, bringing them back to the cold, dusty nursery. The child ghost, Thomas, was no longer angry, but filled with an unbearable sorrow. Eleanor's hum was a lament, a song of eternal mourning. They didn't fall, Ilara realized, the truth dawning on her. They died in a fire, and Eleanor couldn't save them both. "He started it." Eleanor's whisper returned, stronger now, filled with a new, bitter anger. "My husband, he wanted the insurance." The revelation hung in the air, a chilling truth. Their great-aunt's husband, the patriarch of the Blackwood line, had murdered his own family for money. The child ghost, Thomas, now turned his attention to the nursery door. His small, ethereal form surged forward, passing through the wood. They heard a faint, distant crashing sound from below, like something heavy falling. "He's going after him," Lyra whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. "He's going after their father." They knew they had to follow. The nursery door, inexplicably, swung open with a groan. They rushed down the stairs, following the faint, angry energy of the child ghost. They found him in the grand hall, near the main entrance. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and the temperature was fluctuating wildly. The child ghost was a swirling vortex of angry energy, focused on a specific spot on the floor. And there, faintly visible, was another shimmering outline, a tall, imposing male figure, the spectral form of Eleanor's husband, their great-aunt's father. He was not as distinct as the mother and child, more like a fading imprint, but his presence radiated a cold, calculating malice. The child ghost lunged, passing through the spectral form of his father again and again, a silent, furious assault. Eleanor's mournful hum filled the hall, her presence enveloping both her son and the spectral husband. "He will pay," the child's voice snarled, a faint echo in the otherwise silent hall. "He will pay for what he did." Ilara, seeing the full picture now, understood. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a reenactment, a desperate plea for justice. "Eleanor Thomas," she called out, her voice resonating with authority. "Your suffering is known. Your story is heard. He is gone. His physical form is dust, but his actions are revealed." She then turned to the spectral husband, her voice firm. "You, who brought this tragedy upon your family, your treachery is known. Your vile deeds are revealed. You have no power here, only the echoes of your sin." As Alara spoke, the spectral form of the husband flickered violently, then began to dissipate, like smoke in the wind. The child ghost, seeing its tormentor vanish, let out a final, heart-wrenching wail, a sound of both triumph and lingering sorrow. Eleanor's presence intensified, her hum becoming a gentle, almost loving lullaby. She moved towards her son's fading form, enveloping him in a soft, ethereal embrace. The two thermal anomalies merged, shimmering brightly for a moment, then slowly, peacefully, faded away. The air in Blackwood House began to warm. The oppressive cold lifted. The metallic sweet scent of blood and decay vanished, replaced by the faint, lingering scent of old roses, now pure and sweet. The silence that settled over the mansion was no longer suffocating, but a profound, peaceful quiet. Lyra, her face pale but relieved, nodded. "They're gone. They found their peace." Alara looked around the now quiet, empty hall. They weren't malevolent. They were trapped by an injustice, unable to move on until their story was heard, their tormentor acknowledged. They decided not to sell Blackwood House. Instead, they began the arduous task of restoring it, honoring the memory of Eleanor and her children. They found old photographs, letters, and more journals, piecing together the full, tragic story. They even discovered a hidden compartment in the library, containing documents that corroborated Eleanor's accusations against her husband, detailing his financial ruin and desperate measures. Blackwood House, once a place of sorrow and despair, slowly transformed into a place of quiet remembrance. The echoes remained, but they were no longer screams of anguish, but soft whispers of gratitude, of peace. Alara, the pragmatist, learned to trust Lyra's sensitivity, recognizing it as a gift that had brought them not only to a haunted house, but to a profound understanding of their own family's shadowed past. And Lyra, in turn, found a strength she never knew she possessed, a quiet resilience born from confronting the darkness and helping to bring light to those who had been lost. The mansion, once hungry, was now content, a silent guardian of a family's truth, finally at rest. The rain began just as the final bell shrieked, a sudden, cold downpour that turned the schoolyard into a blurry watercolor of gray asphalt and bright yellow raincoats. Alara pulled her thin, threadbare jacket tighter, hunching her shoulders against the biting chill as she joined the jostling throng of students rushing for the bus. She hated the bus. It was always too loud, too crowded, a suffocating metal box that smelled faintly of stale crisps, damp wool, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying grime. But today, a deeper, more profound unease settled in her stomach, a prickle of dread that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual afternoon crush. It was a cold, internal shiver that started in her gut and spread through her veins. The usual chaos of the afternoon bus ride was strangely muted, almost entirely absent. The boisterous laughter of the older boys, usually a cacophony of adolescent energy, was subdued, reduced to barely audible mumbles. The incessant chatter and playful shouts of the middle schoolers, typically a constant buzz, had dwindled to hushed, almost fearful whispers that seemed to cling to the damp air. Even the bus driver, old Mr. Henderson, usually a jovial man with a booming laugh and a penchant for bad jokes, sat hunched over the wheel, his shoulders stiff, his back unusually straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked road with an unusual, almost desperate intensity. The bus itself felt different, too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own, making the familiar interior seem alien and menacing. The engine hummed with a low, almost mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Alara's worn sneakers, and into her very bones, a resonant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living, breathing thing. Alara found her usual seat, 3 rows from the back, by the window, where she could press her forehead against the cool glass and watch the world go by. Her best friend, Liam, usually saved it for her. His worn backpack sprawled across the seat, a silent invitation. But today Liam wasn't there. He hadn't been at school since Tuesday, and the teachers had just said he was unwell. Their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. Alara knew better. Liam had told her about the dreams, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with unshed tears. Dreams of twisted trees reaching like skeletal hands from a perpetual mist, of whispering shadows that promised oblivion, of a cold, grasping hand reaching for him from the darkness beneath his bed. He'd looked pale and drawn, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, like a candle about to gutter out. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, consumed by an invisible terror. As the bus pulled away from the school, the rain intensified, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into an impressionistic blur. Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, trying desperately to distract herself, to focus on the distorted reflections of the streetlights, but her gaze kept drifting, irresistibly, to the other passengers. They seemed different. Their faces were pale, almost bloodless, their skin a sickly gray in the flickering light. Their eyes were wide and glassy, unnaturally still, fixed straight ahead, as if staring at something only they could see. They sat unnaturally stiff, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their knuckles white, as if holding on to something precious, or perhaps holding themselves together, preventing some internal unraveling. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. A small, whimpering sound, barely audible above the engine's drone, broke the heavy silence. Came from the seat directly in front of Alara. A first grader, little Timmy, was clutching a worn teddy bear, its once fluffy fur matted and damp. His face was buried deep in its comforting embrace, but his shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs that seemed to vibrate through the seat back. His older sister, Sarah, usually so protective of her little brother, sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly out the window, seemingly oblivious to his distress, her face a mask of serene emptiness. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping into her jacket. It was the chill of fear, cold and sharp. She leaned forward, gently tapping Sarah on the shoulder, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Sarah, is Timmy okay? He's crying." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain-streaked window, unblinking, unseeing. Alara tapped her again, a little harder, a faint tremor in her hand. Still nothing. Sarah's skin looked unnaturally waxy, almost translucent, in the flickering, erratic light, like old porcelain. A faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the lights flared brightest. A sudden, violent lurch of the bus sent a ripple through the passengers. Not a normal bump in the road, but a deliberate, almost organic shift, as if the bus itself had sighed. A collective sigh, like a soft exhalation of breath from 1,000 lungs, swept through the bus, a faint, rustling sound that made the hairs on Alara's neck stand on end. Alara pulled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. The bus continued its journey, taking what seemed to be the usual route, but each stop felt wrong, profoundly wrong. At the first stop, Mrs. Gable's house, a quaint cottage with a vibrant rose garden. No one got off. Mrs. Gable, a kindly old woman who always had a smile and a wave for the children, stood on her porch, a brightly colored umbrella clutched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea that Alara could almost feel. Mr. Henderson merely drove past, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even seen her. At the next stop, the corner where the twins, Emily and Ben, usually raced off the bus, laughing and shouting, their backpacks bouncing. Today, they remained in their seats, their identical faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, reflecting the flickering lights like polished stones. Their mother stood at the bus stop, a worried frown on her face that slowly morphed into a look of growing panic, then outright terror, as the bus sped by, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Alara felt a knot of ice forming in her stomach, expanding, spreading through her chest. The bus wasn't stopping, it was just driving, and the passengers, they weren't reacting. They were like dolls, frozen in place, their silent, glassy stares fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination known only to them. She tried to call out, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence, but her throat felt constricted, as if a cold, invisible hand was squeezing it, stealing her voice. She tried to move, to get up, to run to the front of the bus, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through thick mud, or as if she were submerged in cold, viscous water. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, like old pennies left too long in the rain, or the taste of blood. The humming of the bus engine grew louder, deeper, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull, a sound that was no longer mechanical but organic, alive. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, more violently, casting the interior of the bus in a strobe-like effect, making the still, pale faces of the passengers seem to twitch and distort, their features melting and reforming in the erratic light. The shadows danced, growing longer, reaching, twisting into grotesque shapes. Alara glanced at Timmy again. He was still whimpering, but now his whimpers were growing fainter, more distant, like an echo fading into nothingness. His teddy bear had slipped from his grasp, lying forgotten on the grimy floor. His eyes, once wide with tears, were now open, staring, and they held the same vacant, glassy quality as Sarah's, as everyone else's. The faint greenish tint on his skin was more pronounced now, like a delicate film of algae. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like the lingering scent of old flowers on a grave, or the cloying perfume of decay, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, then grew stronger, cloying, thick, making Alara's head swim, her stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried and was now stirring. She looked out the window again. The familiar houses and shops, the comforting landmarks of her neighborhood, had given way entirely to dense, unfamiliar woods. The trees were unnaturally tall and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted into grotesque, skeletal forms, their leaves a deep, unnatural green, even in the driving rain, shimmering with an internal light. This wasn't her neighborhood. This wasn't the way home. This was nowhere she had ever seen before. A low, guttural sound, like a deep sigh or a groan from the very earth, emanated from the front of the bus. Mr. Henderson. He was still hunched over the wheel, his grip unyielding, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted. His skin, visible at the nape of his neck and along his jawline, was no longer the healthy tanned color Alara remembered. It was pale, almost translucent, and the faint, sickly green tint was now spreading rapidly across it, like moss growing on stone, deepening with every passing second. His eyes, in the rearview mirror, caught hers for a fleeting moment, and they glowed with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. The bus slowed, the engine's hum deepening into a resonant drone, then came to a gentle, almost imperceptible stop. Not at a bus stop, not on a paved road, but in the middle of a clearing in the dark, ancient woods. The rain had ceased, as if on command, and an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the bus engine and the faint, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a low, hypnotic vibration. The bus door hissed open, not onto the usual asphalt and pavement, but onto a path of dark, damp earth, winding deeper into the woods, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The air outside was thick with the cloying, sweet smell, now almost overpowering, a suffocating perfume that filled Alara's lungs. One by one, the passengers began to stir, not with a sudden jolt, not with the awakening of consciousness, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like puppets whose strings were being gently pulled by an unseen hand. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Their glassy eyes, still fixed straight ahead, held no recognition, no emotion, only that unsettling, blank stare. Timmy, his small body stiff and unyielding, stood up, his hand reaching out for Sarah's. Sarah, in turn, took his hand, her grip unnaturally firm, her fingers intertwining with his with a disturbing precision. They began to file out of the bus, a silent, ghostly procession of pale, unblinking children and teenagers, their faces devoid of emotion, their movements like automatons. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the path into the dark woods, their forms disappearing one by one into the deepening shadows, swallowed by the ancient trees. Alara watched them go, paralyzed by a terror that rooted her to her seat, a fear so profound it stole her breath. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, to claw her way back to the world she knew, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles felt like lead, her will trapped within her own skull. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, a bitter tang, and the faint, sickly green tint she had seen on Mr. Henderson's neck seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, encroaching, consuming. Then a voice, not a human voice, not a whisper, but a soft, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, from the seats, from the floor, from the walls of the bus itself, from the engine, from the trees outside. It was the same tuneless, repetitive melody she had heard the little girl humming in her dreams, the one Liam had described, a melody that was both ancient and utterly alien. Come, the hum whispered, 1,000 voices in one, soft and inviting, yet filled with an ancient, unspeakable hunger, a promise of absorption, of becoming. It's time for your last stop. It's time to join us. Alara felt her own limbs begin to stiffen, a creeping paralysis spreading from her toes upwards, her head tilted to the side, involuntarily, her gaze fixing on the open bus door, on the dark path leading into the heart of the woods. Her eyes, she realized with a dawning horror that was quickly fading, were no longer focusing. They were becoming still, glassy, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights with an unnerving intensity, mirroring the eyes of those who had gone before her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was not her own. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, yet no longer unpleasant, but strangely comforting, familiar. The sickly sweet scent filled her lungs, not cloying now, but a soothing, intoxicating perfume. The green tint was spreading, a cool, soothing sensation across her skin, a transformation that felt less like a curse and more like a homecoming. She stood up, her movements stiff, deliberate like the others. She walked down the aisle, her bare feet. When had she taken off her shoes? She couldn't remember. Making no sound on the grimy floor, her steps silent, precise. She passed Mr. Henderson, still hunched over the wheel, his head now fully turned, his eyes glowing with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. He looked at her, and a silent, knowing hum resonated from him, a greeting, a welcome to their collective. Alara stepped off the bus, onto the damp earth, the cool soil yielding beneath her feet. The air was cool against her skin, and the hum of the woods enveloped her, a lullaby, a welcome, a chorus of 1,000 silent voices. She joined the silent procession, her steps falling into rhythm with theirs, her gaze fixed on the winding path, on the glowing green eyes that awaited her in the shadows. She felt no fear, no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace, of belonging. She was going home, to her new home, to join the others. The bus, its engine still thrumming with that low, resonant hum, sat silently in the clearing, its lights flickering, waiting for the next group of passengers. The last stop was never truly the last. It was just the beginning, the beginning of a new journey into the heart of the woods, into the silent, green embrace of the ancient, hungry things that waited there. And soon, another bus would arrive, another group of children, ready for their own last stop. The old St. Jude's Church stood on a forgotten hill, its stone facade crumbling, its stained glass windows opaque with grime. It wasn't merely old. It felt ancient, burdened by centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken sins. For Father Thomas, a man whose faith had long been eroded by the relentless tide of modern cynicism and personal tragedy, it was a last resort. Assigned to this desolate parish in the remote village of Ashwood, he saw it as either a penance or a final, desperate chance at redemption. He chose to believe the latter, clinging to the faint hope that a return to the fundamentals, to the quiet solitude of a forgotten place, might reignite the dying embers of his belief. The village itself was a collection of weathered cottages, their inhabitants as stoic and unyielding as the surrounding moorland. They eyed Father Thomas with a mixture of suspicion and resignation, their faces etched with a weariness that went deeper than age. They attended his sparse services, their voices flat during hymns, their eyes rarely meeting his. They spoke of the church in hushed tones, referring to it simply as the old place, never by name and always with a subtle shudder. From the moment Father Thomas stepped into St. Jude's, a pervasive cold settled over him. It wasn't the natural chill of a stone building. It was a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his cassock. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made him pull his threadbare stole tighter around him, even as the small, inefficient boiler wheezed in protest. It clung to the air, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. His first few weeks were a blur of solitary tasks. Dusting ancient pews, polishing tarnished brass, trying to decipher the faded Latin inscriptions on forgotten tombs in the overgrown graveyard. The church was vast and empty, its high vaulted ceilings amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The air hung thick with the scent of damp stone, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with the cloying sweetness of long-dead incense. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. At first, he dismissed them as the natural groans of an old building. The creak of ancient timbers settling, the faint whistle of wind through broken panes in the bell tower, the distant hoot of an owl echoing from the surrounding woods. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, rhythmic tapping would begin each night around midnight, originating from the sacristy, the small room where vestments were kept. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on wood, then growing firmer, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It would go on for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Father Thomas's skull. Even when he tried to pray, his rosary beads clutched tight in his trembling hands. He'd pound on the sacristy door, yelling, "Who's there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the cavernous space, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold, damp wood of the door, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold spot became more pronounced. It wasn't just the overall chill of the church. There was a specific area, the altar, that was always unnaturally frigid. Stepping into it was like walking into a meat locker, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that made the hairs on Father Thomas's arms stand on end. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old blood, and something else, too, a faint whiff of stagnant water. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the grimy stained glass windows like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within Father Thomas's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Father Thomas huddled in a pew, the sound of physical presence in the church, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the drumming rain and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. He scrambled from the pew, clutching his Bible, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the sacristy, the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Father Thomas decided to brave the village. He sought out Old Man Hemlock, the oldest parishioner, a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of generations. He found him tending a small, barren garden, his movements slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Mr. Hemlock," Father Thomas began, trying to sound calm, "I've been hearing strange noises in the church, tapping and voices." Old Man Hemlock paused, his gnarled hands stilling over a patch of withered herbs. His eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on Father Thomas's face, a gaze that seemed to pierce through his exhaustion and fear, seeing something beyond. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped his lips, smelling faintly of damp earth and something else, something like ancient fear. "Noises, Father?" he rasped, his voice like rustling leaves, dry and brittle. "That church, it has always been prone to noises, especially at night." He looked back at his garden, but his body language was stiff, guarded, almost defensive. "You hear voices." The way he pronounced the word sent a chill down Father Thomas's spine, his tone shifting, laced with a strange, knowing sorrow that spoke volumes more than his words. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle," Father Thomas stammered, feeling foolish as the words left his mouth, yet unable to stop himself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed Old Man Hemlock's weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He plucked a dead leaf from a plant, crushing it in his hand. "Don't pay it mind, Father," he finally said, his voice dismissive, but his eyes held a strange, distant glint, as if looking at something far beyond the present moment, a vista of unseen horrors. "Some places, they just hold on to things. Best leave them be." The conversation was clearly over. His denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. It confirmed Father Thomas's fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The church comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything Father Thomas had experienced. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of the sacristy wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the church's foundations. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the stone floor, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses, now sickly sweet and putrid. The sanctuary lamp, usually a steady, unwavering flame, began to flicker wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the altar. The crucifix seemed to twist, its wooden form contorting in the dancing light. Father Thomas, unable to bear the laughter and the chanting any longer, found himself drawn to a heavy, iron-bound door set into the floor near the altar. It was a door he'd noticed but dismissed as a disused storage space. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. He could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards beyond the door, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding him, pressing in, mocking his deepest fears. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, collapsing in a heap on the cold stone floor. He looked around, desperate for a sign, a clue. His gaze fell upon an ancient, leather-bound missal left open on the altar. Its pages were brittle with age, the Latin script faded. As he knelt, his trembling fingers traced the words. And then he saw them, the same swirling, intricate symbols that had appeared on the sacristy wall were scrawled in the margins of the missal, accompanying archaic script. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the church, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, iron-bound door near the altar, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the stone floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the altar. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty stone with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the missal had described, the creature that fed on despair, the one for which the church was built as a conduit. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire altar, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Father Thomas with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your faith, my meal. Father Thomas stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His faith, already so fragile, shattered completely. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a fix, it was a pact. He was its sustenance. The church was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Father Thomas screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the pews, past the silent, watchful statues, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The church seemed to come alive around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The stone walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the heavy oak main doors, his hands fumbling with the ancient latch, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the stone floor growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the doors open, snapping the old lock, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the church. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown graveyard, past the crumbling headstones, towards the faint, distant lights of Ashwood. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the winding road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to St. Jude's Church. He abandoned all his belongings, his vestments, his very identity within those walls. The cheap parish had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity and faith. He left Ashwood that night, never looking back, a village now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous room in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His faith wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no longer isolated in his sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that St. Jude's Church wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten prayers. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the church, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him.